Well, it's a pleasure to be here today to talk about the connection between education and incarceration. And this is actually a very broad topic. We could discuss many things. We could discuss the need for rigor and high-quality education in prisons as a path for reducing recidivism. Or we could discuss the impact of incarceration on the education of children when their parents are incarcerated. But I'd like to flip the conversation and talk about the role that education plays in the actual incarceration of individuals. This is often referred to as the school-to-prison pipeline. It's a somewhat oversimplified version would go like this. Children from socioeconomically challenged neighborhoods find themselves in schools that are ill-equipped to create the kind of supportive, pro-social environments that are necessary for these children who are struggling with their poverty. These schools, often spurred by zero-tolerance movements that have emerged over the past 2 decades, begin using suspension and expulsion and other exclusionary strategies as the primary consequence for all of the disruptive behavior in the school. They then begin relying on these suspensions early and often as the primary form of punishment for all types of misdeeds. One suspension begets another. Multiple suspensions often lead to expulsion. And before you know it, the student is no longer in school. And leaving school early, whether voluntarily or through the encouragement of the school, significantly increases the probability of going to prison. So to put it in context, students who are suspended, especially students who are suspended multiple times, are 3 times more likely to end up leaving school. Sometimes leaving school by choice and dropping out, other times leaving school with the encouragement of an expulsion. And to make things worse, of that population, they are 3 times more likely that those who do not graduate from school and leave early are 3 times more likely to end up in prison than their peers. And to complicate matters even more, the original suspensions for these students tend not to be suspensions for violations that relate to the safety of other students or any type of aggression being demonstrated by these students. So the proponents of zero tolerance, combined with these exclusionary discipline tactics, suspensions and expulsions, defend this as the only strategy to maintain order in schools and the only way to be fair to those students who are not misbehaving. Well, the truth is that's not the case. First, research has indicated that these exclusionary discipline strategies aren't very effective. They simply don't work. In fact, the schools that rely upon these strategies tend to be relatively disruptive schools with school climates that aren't particularly well shaped for the needs of any of their students, much less their disruptive students. And second, only about 10 to 20% of suspensions are offenses that have anything to do with school safety or improving the climate for others. So we're simply overusing suspensions and expulsions. Now, as a guy who spends a lot of time in schools and as Dean of the School of Education at Johns Hopkins University, I regularly see how administrators, teachers, and even other students struggle with the school climate and creating a positive environment. And it's true that not much learning occurs in schools without discipline and positive school cultures. The answer, however, is not to exclude those students who are having trouble functioning within that environment. And the answer is certainly not suspensions and expulsions. The answer is, however, to figure out a way to create more positive, supportive environments for all children through implementing the most evidence-based strategies to lead to higher success levels for all of the students and to improve the community. So there are a few ways to do that. To leave you with some suggestions. The research indicates that this is very possible to do, and actually we have seen schools functioning in this manner in very, very tough neighborhoods with very high socioeconomic challenges and with teachers who are working day in and day out to create these positive environments. So the first is a school-wide strategy to create positive behavioral interventions and support. These strategies utilize very consistent and clear communications of expectations, high expectations for behavioral compliance, but support for positive behavior rather than punitive consequences. And when there is the need for consequences, being very careful about graduated sanctions. Graduated sanctions means the punishment needs to fit the crime. And in the last sanction being removal from that setting. The second strategy is early intervention and prevention. We know that we can't start early enough in diagnosing children and providing interventions for children who have trouble managing their own behavior. We know that antisocial behavior in high-risk settings like disadvantaged neighborhoods happens more frequently than it does in other neighborhoods. And if we're going to address this, we have to think about identifying early starters, early antisocial children who are having trouble managing their own behavior, who are having trouble with self-regulation, executive function. There are very effective strategies for us to address interventions with those students, peer-based interventions as well as interventions with adults. So we need to get those interventions in very early and effectively across all of our schools. The third approach is to be much more creative about alternatives to exclusionary consequences. Exclusionary consequences are simply suspensions and expulsions. And in some ways, the easiest way to eliminate behaviors, unwanted behaviors in schools, is to remove the actor from the environment. It's a simple way to support the other students and to support the teachers. It's simply not effective for the school itself and certainly not effective for those disruptive children. Three things to consider. One, we already talked about graduated sanctions. That is, the punishment fits the crime. You start with consequences that allow the students to stay in the school and make amends for their behavior. The second is restorative justice. We need to look at consequences that actually help offenders in schools, those who have broken the rules, find a way to restore their place in that school, whether it's their reputation with their teacher, whether it's their reputation with their peers, whether it's making amends for a destructive act of school property by replacing that or fixing it. Basically fix the damage that was done and make certain that you restore your place in that community. And the final is looking at alternatives to suspension and expulsion that include in-school suspensions and in-school alternative educational settings. The key to this is those settings have to be very high quality and really have to address the behavioral issues of the students as well as the academic issues coming forward. And I'll close with one analogy. You know, this is sometimes called the Brer Rabbit syndrome. You know, the last thing that we want to do with students who are struggling in school is to tell them, send the message that you no longer need to come to school. Because when you no longer need to come to school, you've effectively granted them their wishes, and the long-term consequences of that are clearly associated with a higher probability of incarceration. So as we move forward, we need to think creatively and innovatively about how schools can retain students rather than encouraging them to leave the system.